I was born and raised in a small town called Oak Ridge. Not much happened there. The town had about 500 people, maybe fewer. Most of us knew each other, or at least knew of each other. There was one main street with a few stores, an old diner, a tiny hardware shop, and a gas station that didn't look like it had been open in years. The rest of the town was surrounded by forests, rolling hills, and fields. I always thought it was a peaceful place, quiet, safe, until one summer night when everything changed. I'd been away for a few years, living in the city, working a regular job like everyone else. But after the passing of my parents, I decided to return to Oak Ridge. I thought it would help me heal, to go back to where I grew up and find some peace. I didn't expect things to be much different, but they were. Not at first, though. It was late when I arrived back in Oak Ridge. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, and the streets were quiet. There were no streetlights in my old neighborhood, just the soft glow of the moon above. The house I grew up in was just as I remembered, old, with peeling paint and a creaky front porch. I grabbed my bag from the car and walked up the gravel path, the crunch of stones beneath my boots the only sound in the silence. I unlocked the front door, and the familiar smell of dust and wood hit me as I stepped inside. It felt like I had never. That night, I slept soundly in my old room, despite the strange feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It was nothing, I told myself, just the memories, just the quiet. The next morning, I went to the diner for breakfast. It was small and run down, the kind of place where everyone knew your name. I walked in, and the bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. "Look who's back!" a woman called from behind the counter. It was Mrs. Fletcher, the diner owner. She had been working there since I was a kid. "Hey, Mrs. Fletcher," I said with a smile. "Long time no see." She smiled back, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness maybe. I couldn't quite place it. "Your parents would have been proud of you, you know," she said, handing me a cup of coffee. "Such a good kid." "Thanks," I replied, sitting down at one of the booths. The diner was nearly empty, but there were a few people scattered around. A man sat at the counter reading a newspaper. A couple sat in the back corner, talking in low voices. It felt like nothing had changed at all. But as I looked out the window, something caught my eye. Across the street, in the old cemetery by the church, I saw a figure standing by one of the gravestones. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could tell it was a person, just standing there, not moving, watching. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The rest of the day passed quietly. I unpacked a few things in the house, trying to settle in. I noticed some of the old neighbors had stopped by to say hello. Mrs. Carter, who used to live next door, came by with a plate of cookies. We chatted for a while, but there was something off about her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was afraid of something. "I'm sure you've heard the news," she said at one point, her voice trembling. "Things haven't been the same around here for a while." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Mrs. Carter hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There've been whispers, strange things happening out by the woods. People are scared, but they don't talk about it. Not much, anyway." I tried to brush it off as gossip, as small-town rumors. But as she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong in Oak Ridge. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a soft sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but it was too. Rhythmic. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I opened the window and looked out into the darkness. The street was empty, the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing was there. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind my house. There was an old oak tree I used to climb as a kid, and I thought I might sit under it for a while and remember the good time. The forest was thick, the kind of forest that swallowed sound. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their branches tangled above, blocking out the sky. It was quiet, too quiet. I had to shake the feeling that someone was following. When I reached the oak tree, I stopped and stared at it for a moment. It looked bigger than I remembered, its trunk wide and twisted. The ground around it was covered in thick roots and fallen leaves. That's when I saw it. Carved into the bark of the tree was a symbol. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was a shape I recognized, a circle with a line through it, like a crude version of an ancient rune. It was old, weathered, but unmistakable. I ran my fingers over the carving, shivers crawling up my spine. I had seen that symbol before, in books about old superstitions and forgotten rituals. It was a sign. A warning. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The woods were as still as ever, the silence almost suffocating. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I hurried back home, my heart pounding. That evening, I went to the gas station to pick up some supplies. The station was run by a man named Mr. Harris, an old-timer who had been in Oak Ridge longer than anyone could remember. As I walked in, he looked up from behind the counter and gave me a nod. "Back home, eh?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I said. "It's been a while." Mr. Harris eyed me carefully, then lowered his voice. "I don't know if you've heard, but there's something strange happening in these parts." I nodded slowly. I had heard rumors, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. "It's the woods," he continued, glancing over his shoulder. "There's something out there, something old. People don't talk about it much, but it's been here a long time. Longer than any of us." "Like what?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Mr. Harris paused, looking around again. He leaned in closer. "The whispering pines," he whispered. "That's what they call the woods. They say there's something in there, something that watches, that listens. If you go too deep, you might never come back. Some people say they hear voices, whispers, like the trees are talking to you." I laughed nervously. "Come on, Mr. Harris. You don't really believe that, do you?" He didn't laugh. "You haven't seen it yet then. But you will. Oak Ridge, it's not what it seems." I didn't think much of Mr. Harris's warning at the time. But that night, as I sat in my living room, I heard them again, the whispers. It started faintly, like a breeze through the trees. But soon, the sound grew louder. It was more than wind. It was voices, low and distant, as if someone was calling my... I went to the window, pulling back the curtain to see what was going on. The street was empty. But then I saw it, just beyond the tree line, the faint shape of someone standing. I squinted. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A shadow, tall and thin, with elongated limbs. The whispering was coming from it. The voice was soft, like 1,000 people speaking in unison, calling me. I froze, unable to move. The figure took a step forward, then another. Slowly, it began to approach my house. I stood there, frozen, staring out the window. My heart was racing in my chest, and I could feel the sweat running down my back. The shadow continued to move closer, its limbs bending unnaturally, like they didn't belong to a human at all. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but still not clear enough for me to understand what they were saying. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. The thing outside, whatever it was getting closer, its shape barely visible in the moonlight. It had no face, just a dark outline that seemed to stretch and twist with each step. I knew I had to get away, but the fear held me in place. The whispers called to me again, this time more urgently. It sounded almost like my name, but distorted, as if they were coming from the depths of a well. The air felt colder, the room darker, as though the very space around me was being swallowed up by this strange presence. I snapped out of my trance. I had to leave, had to get away from whatever this was. I grabbed my keys from the table and rushed toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, there was a sudden, loud knock. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and insistent. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. The knocking continued, harder this time, louder, as if someone or something was desperate to get in. I glanced at the window again. The figure was gone, but the whispers lingered, filling the air around me. I turned back to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, followed by a voice. It was soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. The voice sent a chill down my spine. It was wrong, too hollow, too deep. It didn't belong to any person I knew. Without thinking, I bolted for the back door, running out into the yard. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that house, from whatever was trying to reach me. The cold night air hit my face as I sprinted across the grass, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods were just beyond the yard, the trees looming like dark giants. I ran straight toward them, not stopping to look back. The moment I stepped into the forest, the whispers grew louder. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking, their voices swirling around me, pressing in from every direction. I stumbled through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes, my feet slipping on the damp ground. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees became taller, more twisted, their bark dark and gnarled like the fingers of some ancient creature reaching out to grab me. The moonlight barely broke through the canopy, casting strange shadows across the forest. Then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the trees, there was a light, faint at first, but growing brighter as I moved closer. It wasn't the glow of a campfire or a lantern. It was a cold, unnatural light, like the moon itself was bleeding into the forest. I approached cautiously, my feet heavy with dread. The air was thick, like I was walking through a fog. When I finally reached the source of the light, I saw the last thing I ever expected. There, in the heart of the forest, stood an old stone altar. It was covered in moss and vines, ancient and weathered, but unmistakable. The altar had been there for as long as I could remember, hidden deep in the woods, but I never thought much of it when I was a child. It was just a relic of the past, an old marker from the town's forgotten history. But now, standing in front of it, I could feel something was wrong. The whispers were louder than ever, swirling around me like a whirlwind. I could hear words now, clear but distorted, like the voices were trying to break through from another world. I stepped closer to the altar, drawn by an unseen force. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow. And then I saw it. Carved into the stone was the same symbol I had seen on the oak tree, the circle with the line through it. But this time, the symbol wasn't just carved, it was glowing. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from the stone, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the stone. The moment I did, the forest seemed to come alive. The whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices, all shouting at once, a chorus of sound that filled my ears and rattled my bones. "Leave! Leave now!" the voices screamed, but it was too late. The ground beneath me trembled, and the trees around me seemed to bend and twist, their trunks creaking like they were alive. And then, in the center of the clearing, something began to rise from the earth. At first, it was just a shadow, but it grew, slowly, like a massive, dark shape emerging from the soil. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the figure took form. It had no face, no eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, bearing down. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my legs stiff with terror. The figure loomed closer, its shape flickering in and out of focus, like it was made of smoke and shadow. I could hear it now, its voice, low, guttural, as if it came from the deepest part of the earth. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out toward me, its fingers long and sharp, and I could feel the air grow colder with each passing second. And then, just as it was about to touch me, I heard a voice. "Run!" I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw someone standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Mrs. Fletcher, the diner owner, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, I ran toward her. I didn't know why I trusted her, but in that moment it was all I could do. I ran as fast as I could, the forest closing in around me, but Mrs. Fletcher was always just ahead. She didn't look back, didn't stop, as though she knew exactly where she was going. The shadows behind us seemed to follow, but with each step, they grew fainter. The whispers died down, and the air grew warmer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees and found ourselves back at the edge of Oak Ridge. Mrs. Fletcher didn't stop running. We reached the diner, and she shoved open the door, pulling me inside. I was gasping for breath, my chest tight with fear. "What was that?" I managed to choke out. Mrs. Fletcher locked the door behind us, her face pale. "It's not just the woods, it's the whole town. Oak Ridge is built on something older than us, something that shouldn't be disturbed." I stared at her in disbelief. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It's been here for centuries, Sarah. The thing in the woods, the whispers, it's all part of something darker, something that has waited for the right moment to wake up." And that's when I realized I had made a terrible mistake by coming back. Oak Ridge wasn't the peaceful town I remembered. It was a place cursed by something far older and more dangerous than I could ever understand. And now, it was coming for me. Mrs. Fletcher didn't say much after that. She simply led me to the back room of the diner, where the thick wooden door creaked open to reveal a small, dimly lit space. There were a few chairs around a table, and an old bookshelf filled with dusty books. It smelled like stale coffee and old paper. She closed the door behind us and locked it with a key. She sat down at the table and motioned for me to sit across from her. "Listen, Sarah," she began, her voice shaking just slightly. "You don't know what you've stumbled into, Oak Ridge. It's not just a quiet little town. It never." I sat there, still catching my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The figure in the woods, the whispers, the strange symbol. It felt like my whole world had been turned upside down in just a matter of days. What do you mean?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "The town. It was built on an old burial ground. Before Oak Ridge, there was a different village here, a settlement. It was abandoned after strange things began to happen. People went missing, crops failed, livestock died in bizarre ways. It was like something was draining the life from the land." I frowned, not understanding. "But why didn't anyone ever talk about I?" "Because the ones who remained here, the ones who survived, they made a pact. They sealed whatever it was away, buried it deep in the forest where it couldn't harm anyone. But the land, it still remembers. The woods, the stones, the oak trees, they carry the memory of what happened here. And the curse. It's never gone away." I leaned forward, struggling to process the weight of her words. "So, the thing in the woods, it's part—" "Yes," Mrs. Fletcher said, her eyes darkening. "It's not just some ghost or spirit. It's something older, something that feeds on fear, on despair. And it was waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" I echoed, confusion flooding my mind. She nodded slowly. "You're connected to this place in ways you don't understand. Your parents. They were part of the reason why the curse never fully took hold. They were strong enough to keep it at bay for a while. But when they passed, the balance shifted. The thing in the woods, whatever it is, sensed the change, and now it's coming for you." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But I don't even know what it is. I don't know how to stop." Mrs. Fletcher sighed and leaned back in her chair. "The truth is, no one really knows what it is. Some say it's an ancient spirit, others think it's something far darker, something born from the land itself, like a parasite that has fed off the fear of every generation that's come through this town. The one thing we do know is that it's bound to the land. And as long as you're here, as long as you stay in Oak Ridge, it will keep coming." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "But I can't leave. I have nowhere else to Gigi." Her face softened slightly. "I know, but you need to understand that staying here, staying in Oak Ridge, it's not just about living here. It's about what you're living." I was silent for a long moment. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating me. My entire life, I had thought Oak Ridge was a safe place, a peaceful town where nothing ever happened. But now I knew the truth, and I didn't know what to do with it. Mrs. Fletcher broke the silence. "There's something that can be done," she said quietly, her voice serious. "There's an old ritual, one that was used by the first settlers of this town. It's the only way to keep the thing in the woods from claiming anyone else. But it's dangerous, and it hasn't been performed in over 100 years. I looked at her, my mind spinning. "What kind of ritual?" She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "It's a binding, a way to trap whatever it is in the woods to prevent it from feeding off the town. But the cost is high. It takes someone with a strong connection to the land, someone who was born here, someone like—" I shook my head, my stomach churning. "You want me to do it? You want me to be the one to, what, sacrifice my—" "No," she said quickly, her face tightening. "It's not a sacrifice. But you'll have to make a choice. The ritual requires a bloodline that has been tied to this town for generations. Your family, your parents, they knew about the curse. They were the ones who kept it in check." "But if they knew, why didn't they tell me?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why didn't they warn me about what was really going on?" Mrs. Fletcher looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. "They didn't want to scare you, and by the time they realized how bad things had gotten, it was too—" I was silent, feeling a sharp pang of guilt mixed with anger. My parents had kept me in the dark. They had let me grow up thinking that Oak Ridge was just another quiet, sleepy town. But the truth was far more horrifying than I could have imagined. And now it's my turn? I asked bitterly, my voice hoarse. Now I have to fix their mistake. She nodded slowly, her face grim. Yes, but you don't have to do it alone. I'll help you. There are others in this town who know about the curse, people who understand how the ritual works. But you'll have to act quickly, before the thing in the woods grows strong. The saying pressed down on me like a stone. I had no choice. The thing in the woods wasn't just an evil spirit, it was an ancient predatory force, and if I didn't stop it, it would continue to claim lives, maybe even mine. I spent the next few days preparing, trying to gather the courage to face what lay ahead. Mrs. Fletcher wasn't the only one who knew about the curse. I spoke to a few of the older townsfolk, people who had lived here their entire lives. They all spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of saying too much. But they all agreed on one thing. The town was cursed, and it was only a matter of time before the thing in the woods came from. The ritual, they said, was simple but dangerous. It required a special place in the woods, a clearing where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin. I had to go there, stand at the altar, and perform the binding. The thing in the woods would try to stop me, to drag me into the darkness. But if I succeeded, the curse would be lifted for a while. The town would be safe. But that safety came at a price. I had to decide if I was willing to pay it. The night of the ritual arrived. I went to the woods with Mrs. Fletcher and a few of the older townfolk who had agreed to help. The air was thick with anticipation, and the whispers in the trees seemed louder than ever. I could feel the presence of the thing in the woods, watching us from the shadow. When we reached the clearing, I could see the altar glowing faintly with that same eerie green light. The ritual was simple. I had to stand before the altar, speak the words of binding, and offer a drop of blood to the earth. The old ones would guide me, chanting the words as I performed the binding. But as I stepped forward, the ground trembled beneath my feet. The trees around us began to shake, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. It was coming. The figure appeared again, rising from the ground like a shadow. Its limbs stretched, its voice like 1,000 screams as it reached for me. But I was ready. I stood tall, my heart racing, and spoke the words of binding. By blood and earth, by stone and tree, I bind you to the land, never to be free. The figure screamed, its shape flickering in the air, but it couldn't touch me. The ground beneath my feet cracked open, and the green light from the altar blazed bright. The thing in the woods let out a final, ear-piercing wail, and then it was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body trembling with exhaustion. The town was silent, the whispers in the trees gone. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge felt peaceful. But I knew this peace wouldn't last forever. The curse was bound, but only for... As I left the woods, I looked back once more. The altar was quiet, the air still. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the thing in the woods would stir again. And when it did, Oak Ridge would be waiting. If you've ever driven through Hollow Creek, you probably didn't think much of it. Just another small, dying town in the middle of nowhere. But if you stopped and talked to the locals, you'd hear about the old... It's hard to miss. The building sits at the edge of town, tall and crumbling, with broken windows that make it look like it's always watching. It's been abandoned for as long as I can remember, and everyone has a story about why. Fires, accidents, even murder, they're all part of the mill's legend. I used to think it was just that, a legend. Stories meant to keep kids like me from messing around in a dangerous old building. But after what happened to me, I don't think that anymore. It was a summer night, warm and quiet, the kind of night where the cicadas drown out your thoughts. My best friend Nate and I were hanging out near the creek, skipping rocks and talking about nothing. "We should check out the mill," Nate said suddenly. I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Yeah, right. And end up like those kids in the store?" "Come on, Alex," he said, grinning. "You don't believe that stuff, do you?" "Of course not," I lied. The truth was, the stories had always creeped me out. People said shadows moved inside the mill at night, even when no one was there. Some swore they heard voices coming from the empty building, whispers that didn't stop until you looked. But Nate wasn't going to let it go. He had that stubborn look on his face, the one that meant he wouldn't back down. "Let's just go take a look. What's the worst that could happen?" I sighed. It wasn't like I could let him go alone. Fine, but we're not going inside. The mill looked even worse up close. The brick walls were streaked with black, and the metal doors were rusted shut. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, and every step we took on the overgrown path seemed louder than it should have. "See? Nothing to be scared of," Nate said, though his voice was quieter than usual. We circled the building, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Broken glass crunched under our feet, and the beams of light reflected off jagged shards still clinging to the window frame. Then, we heard it. A faint sound like a low hum, coming from inside the mill. I froze. "What?" Nate shrugged, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder as we stood there, shifting from a hum to something like a whisper. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate didn't move. "It's probably—" The whisper turned into a sharp laugh, cutting him off. It echoed out of the empty windows, too loud, too real. We both bolted. I thought that would be the end of it, just another stupid memory we'd laugh about later. But something changed after that night. The whispers didn't stay in the mill. It started small. I'd be in my room trying to fall asleep, and I'd hear faint murmurs, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. At first, I thought it was my parents downstairs, but when I got up to check, the house was silent. The shadows came next. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, just quick flashes of black darting across the walls. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the whispers grew louder, and the shadows became harder to ignore. They weren't just flickers anymore. They lingered, dark and shapeless, standing in the corners of my room or lurking in the hallway. One night, I woke up to find a shadow standing by my bed. It didn't have a face or features, just a tall black shape that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It leaned closer, and for the first time, the whispers were clear. "You shouldn't have gone." I stopped sleeping after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the whispers or see the shadows. I tried to tell Nate, but he just laughed it off, saying I was letting the stories go. But I wasn't the only one. Nate started missing school, and when I went to his house to check on him, he looked awful. His eyes were sunken, and he flinched at every little sound. "You hear them too, don't you?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the corner of the room, where a shadow was darker than it should have been. We shouldn't have gone to the mill," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Things got worse after that. The shadows grew bolder, stepping into the light and following me wherever I went. I'd feel them behind me, cold and heavy. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. The whispers started saying my name over and over until I couldn't stand it anymore. One night, I decided I had to go back. I thought maybe if I faced whatever was in the mill, it would leave me. I didn't tell Nate. He was too far gone, barely speaking, and I didn't want to drag him any deeper into this. The mill was worse than I remembered. The air was thick, choking, and the shadows seemed to pulse with light. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers were waiting for me, louder now, overlapping until they were almost deafening. "Why did you come back?" one of them hissed. The shadows moved, swirling around me like smoke. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. You can't leave," the voices said, and I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. I don't know how I got out. One moment I was trapped, the shadows closing in, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. The whispers are quieter now, and the shadows don't come as often. But I know they're still there, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself in Hollow Creek, stay far away from the old mill. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. You've probably never heard of Willow Creek. It's the kind of town that doesn't make maps, where nothing much happens, and the only excitement comes from gossip or the occasional high school football game. But if you ever visited, you'd hear one thing for sure. Don't go near the forest at the edge of town. The Whispering Woods, they call it. I never believed in the stories. Sure, they were spooky, but I've always been the kind of person who needs to see something to believe it. Ghosts, monsters, curses. None of it seemed real to me, at least not until that night. It started with a fight. My sister Emily and I had been bickering all evening. I don't even remember what it was about. Probably something stupid, like whose turn it was to do the dishes. But the fight escalated, and I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I wasn't thinking about where I was going. I just wanted to get away. The cool night air hit my face and I started walking. My feet seemed to carry me on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the woods. The forest was darker than I remembered. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisted together in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The air was colder here, and the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, the distant hum of cars had disappeared. I told myself it was just a forest. I'd been inside it before during the day. There were hiking trails and picnic spots, nothing unusual. But at night, it felt different. The shadows were thicker, the silence heavier. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight from my pocket, flicked it on, and stepped into the trees. At first, it was fine. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound. I told myself I'd walk for a few minutes, clear my head, and then head home. But the further I went, the stranger everything felt. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The trees leaned closer together, their branches curling like fingers. My flashlight didn't seem to reach as far as it should have, and the shadows at the edge of the beam looked like they were moving. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, like someone murmuring far away. I stopped in my tracks and swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the darkness. The whisper came again. It wasn't words exactly, just a soft, hissing sound. My heart started to race. I told myself it was the wind, maybe the leaves rustling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The whispers grew louder as I walked. They seemed to come from all around me, circling like a swarm of bees. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the path in front of me, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My name, Mia. It was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then, just ahead, something moved. I swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered, dimming for a second before coming back to life. In that brief moment of darkness, I saw something, a figure standing between the trees. It was pale, almost glowing, and its limbs were too long, its body too thin. Its eyes were hollow pits, dark and empty, and its face didn't have a mouth. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled a few feet away. I scrambled to grab it, my fingers shaking, and when I shined it back toward the figure, it was gone. But the whispers were back. "Mia," they were louder now, more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching like arms. I stood up and started to run, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The path was gone. No matter which way I turned, there was nothing but trees and darkness. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. Then I saw the figure again. It was ahead of me this time, standing perfectly still. Its head tilted to the side as if it were studying me. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. But the words didn't come from its non-existent mouth. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned and ran the other way, my legs burning with every step. The trees seemed alive, their roots reaching up to trip me, their branches scratching at my arms. I could feel the figure behind me, even though I didn't dare look back. Finally, I saw a light ahead. My heart leapt with hope, and I sprinted toward it. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel the forest pulling at me, trying to drag me back. But I didn't stop. I burst out of the trees and collapsed onto the road, gasping for air. When I looked back, the forest was still and silent. The trees stood like they always had, as if nothing had happened. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and trying to catch my breath. Eventually, I got up and walked home. When I told my family what happened, they didn't believe me. Emily thought I was making it up to scare her, and my parents said I must have let my imagination run wild. But I know what I saw. The Whispering Woods isn't just a forest, it's alive. It watches, it waits, and sometimes it calls you by name. Since that night, I've stayed far away. But sometimes late at night, I hear it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind, Mia, and I know it's still waiting for me.